start off with a quote that I found that I really like. We are not primarily spiritual beings who happen to live in a body, but we are incarnational creatures who will remain so through all eternity. And so this is a good theology, but I don't think that we always, in practice, do a good job of really understanding what it means that we are truly incarnational creatures. And so picking up a little bit on what we talked about last week, we're going to briefly review, for those of you who weren't here last time, what we talked about, and then move on particularly to look at some of the implications of the fact that we are these incarnational beings. So last time I talked about the fact that in terms of our relationships with our bodies, we tend to be influenced very much by our culture, that has kind of a hard dualism that really makes us separate ourselves out from our body and then treat our bodies in certain ways. And I've distinguished between the modern body, where the predominant mode is the mind over body, where we don't value the information that our body gives us, but instead are kind of stuck in our heads. And we use our bodies really as a boundary to separate us from other people rather than as something to connect us. And we are overall quite suspicious of the body. We see the body as being the problem. It's a source of subjectivity and bias and mortality and all that other stuff. And then in more recent years, and probably the mode that is most familiar to our students at this point, is the postmodern body. And so in addition to kind of the separation from the body that was also there with modernity, what we have now is a great deal of sensuality that is emphasized by our culture. And also availability of a number of different technological advances that give us a great deal of control over our bodies, particularly assaulting bodily limitations. Things like space and geographic location and that kind of thing are no longer things that we need to be limited by. And so our bodily boundaries are, in a sense, expanding because of technology. And the mode for which the body is used seems to be kind of an image manipulation. Our body is something that we kind of fix up and do things to in order to present ourselves in certain contexts, in certain specific ways, as if it were a tool for marketing ourselves rather than an integral part of who we are. And so these distortions are things that we have to face, that we have to recognize in ourselves if we are to move beyond them and try to live our incarnational lives in a different way. Another thing that I talked about last time is that I briefly went over what psychology can tell us about the functions of the body. And I talked about this in 4 areas. In the area of perception, using our 5 senses and our sense of being, of proprioception, of being in space, and how these are all linked to gathering important information from the world and helping us to embody a certain way of doing relationships in the world. I talked briefly about emotions and the fact that our emotions are interpersonal in nature, that a good awareness of our emotions is necessary in order to navigate well the interpersonal world. Sexuality, that when it's distorted, it's merely pleasure-seeking, but at its best, it's really a powerful tool for helping us to connect well to our intimate other. And then finally, one thing our body does is it roots us in a certain geographic location, in a certain historical time period. Even factors like our geographical setting are all things that are typical of our body, and that it turns out the more emplaced we are, the more rooted we are, the better it is for our well-being. And so in conclusion, after looking at all of those things, I suggested that the message that we get from looking at the functions of the body as examined by psychology and the other social sciences is that our body is designed to facilitate relationships. That's really kind of when you look at its functions, it seems to be exquisitely designed in all of the different things that it does in order to allow us to connect well to others. It's interesting that Scripture also has a direct answer to what the body is for. And so just briefly, this verse here, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 13, and then a little later in the chapter, the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord. The body is for the Lord. And the Lord is for the body. And then that chapter concludes by saying, therefore glorify God in your body. And the thing about glorifying God, it's something that we use often in our kind of Christian lingo, but we're not always quite sure what it means to glorify God. But what it means to glorify God is to show His glory. To show His glory means to demonstrate His presence and His power. And in showing God's presence and power through our bodies, we are really following Jesus' example in the incarnation. And so this is what Eric talked about last time, and it's kind of the link between these two parts here. Luke Timothy Johnson is a Catholic theologian, and he writes that the entire point of the incarnation is that the human body of Jesus was capable of bearing and revealing the power and presence of God somaticos in the flesh need scarcely be argued. The words of John's prologue remain the classic text. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the incarnation clearly demonstrates that the human body can in fact reveal God. It can show his presence and power. So in fact, in saying that our telos, that the goal of our body is to be for the Lord, the conclusion I think for our embodied lives is that we must do it in the way that our bodily actions and our interactions with others reveals to them who God is, that they show who he is in his power and glory and strength. And I think that when we pull together the message from psychology and the message from Scripture about the purposes of our bodies, that we get to very interesting conclusions that our bodies are designed to show people who God is, primarily through the relational functions of the body. And so Eric and I are going to use this kind of as a thesis statement for exploring some implications of the incarnation in different areas.
When I spoke last time, I wanted to ensure that we had the biblical basis for the true embodiment and true humanity of Christ. I just came across a survey that was done by a Christian organization at a conference for Christian leaders. The Christian Booksellers Association was the conference, and that's pastors, ministry leaders, Christian publishers, Christian authors, the people who decide what Christians are presented with is what they should read. And one of the questions that they were asked was, true or false, Jesus was truly God and only merely appeared to be in human form? And 44% agreed with that statement. Which is something called Docetism, which is this idea that Jesus only appeared to be human and wasn't fully and completely human. And I'm deeply concerned that because we've spent our lives as Christians defending the deity of Christ, we easily neglect and diminish the humanity of Christ. You've never had an argument with someone trying to prove to them that Jesus was human. People assume that in our culture. The problem is the deity of Christ, and so then we can, in an effort to defend that, really end up diminishing his true humanity. And it's a profound, mysterious incomprehensibility that Jesus is fully God and fully man. So when we try to work that out, usually what takes the hit in our efforts to rationalize it is his humanity. We end up detracting from it in an effort to maintain full deity, as if those two can't truly come together with neither being diminished. And so last time we looked at Jesus' full, complete humanity, including an embodiment that included a human birth and all the physical limitations that come with being finite and embodied, including thirst and hunger and tiredness and even suffering and death. To cease to function biologically is what Jesus experienced. The full extent of human embodiment and the finitude that comes with that. So we looked at that last time. I did want to mention something that we didn't have time for last time, but it's this something called Gnosticism, which you've probably all heard of, and many of you know what it is. But I just want to make sure we realize what a massive enemy this has been of good Christian theology throughout the centuries. It wasn't full-blown Gnosticism in the early church, although we see the seeds of it already being combated by, say, John, when he says that we know Antichrist by those who deny that Christ really came in the flesh. We're already getting attacks on the true embodiment of Jesus in an effort to explain the incarnation. Now, this Gnostic assumption is that, one, there's a radical dualism between body and soul, and two, the body is a negative. It's an evil even. And to be what God intends for us to be, we need to transcend the body. We need to become other than, and not redeem the body, but get away from it. It's a prison house of the soul that we need to transcend. And so when you come with assumptions like that to the incarnation, well, you've got to explain away the true humanity of Christ to the point where you start to formulate ideas like the Docetic view did, which was that Jesus, it's this to appear. He just appeared human. And this famous Docetic quote was, when Jesus walked on the beach, he left no footprints. There's this idea that Jesus was just an appearance of humanity to the point where he didn't leave real footprints on the beach. So that little poem on your bathroom mirror, footprints in the sand, needs to be revised. That then when Jesus carried you, there were no footprints in the sand at all, yours or his. And so, it's a very different way of looking at Christ than the Bible does, in that we have to, but we've had a tendencies toward Gnosticism in the history of the church. A couple things I want to point out about that. One is how destructive that is to a true humanity of Christ and a true doctrine of the person of Christ, but that has devastating implications for the way we view our salvation and the way we view the Christian life. Think about a negative or even evil view of humanity and how you then need to re-explain Jesus and view the Christian life and what it is that gets redeemed and what it is that gets sanctified. See, it's got implications for all these other doctrines as we think about it. So these docetic views have invaded the church, and they have a devastating effect on the way we view all of life. And so we need to be aware of these tendencies and root them out. I do want to make a few implications for the embodied life that Liz and I came up with years ago in an article we published. The first thing is that Jesus' true humanity is necessary for him to redeem us. If he's not fully human, he doesn't really represent us. I presented one time on the doctrine of the humanity of Christ at a conference, and afterward, a man came up to me who has probably published more books than any other Christian. And he said, "Come on, do you really believe Jesus is fully human and was tempted in every way, even sexually?" And I said, "Well, he better have been, or else I'm going to hell." Jesus needed to be tempted in every way, including sexually, to be able to overcome that in our place and represent us in that. And if Jesus doesn't represent us and die as a sacrifice, fully representing us and fulfill all righteousness for us in every way humans need to have that fulfilled in light of our disobedience, then we're hopeless. We don't have true redemption if Jesus isn't truly our substitute sacrifice and true mediator between God and man in this way. Secondly, Jesus' incarnation is necessary for him to be our sympathetic high priest. Hebrews 2:18 says, "Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." This really has an effect on the way we view the immutability of God. God is essentially immutable, unchangeable, but relationally mutable. There are experiences God has that he has because the Son took on flesh that he was not capable of having before he took on flesh. And he suffers. He wasn't able to do that before. He's tempted. He wasn't able to do that before. And because of that, Hebrews 2:18 says, he's able to save us, those who are being tempted. Hebrews 4 puts it this way: "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are." His embodiment, his finitude, is necessary for him to be tempted in every way as we are. And yet he was without sin. And in light of that, then Hebrews encourages us to do this. "Let us then, in light of the fact that he's been tempted as we are, approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need." Our ability to approach the throne of grace with confidence comes from the fact that Jesus was tempted in every way like we are and becomes a merciful and faithful high priest because of that. If you remove that true ability by removing his true embodiment and humanity, you remove salvation. We don't have that boldness any longer to approach the throne of grace. Another implication is Jesus reveals true humanity to us. When we think about these Gnostic implications of disdain for the body, disdain for true humanity and the limitations that come with that, we realize that the problem with us is not this. The problem with us is the perversion of this. It's the fallenness of this, but because this is fallen and perverted, it's easy for us to assume this is the problem. And if we could just get beyond this, we'd be okay. Rather than saying, no, we need to redeem this and see it resurrected and glorified, we think just getting rid of it will be helpful. But Jesus comes and gives a radical affirmation to our true humanity and to this. and sees this perfectly obeying the commands of God, not by pulling the deity card every time he's tempted, but by depending on the Scriptures and the work of the Spirit in his life, and fellowship and worship, corporately and privately, and solitude and spiritual disciplines. He overcomes temptation in this, and we see this obedient and ultimately redeemed and resurrected and glorified. And so our intended finitude is something we need to come to grips with. God made us finite. He made us limited. He made us embodied. That's a central way we experience these limitations. We are creatures, not the Creator. This is one of the fundamental ways we affirm that distinction. Paganism will always try to obliterate the distinction between the Creator and the creature. Embracing our finitude affirms that distinction between the Creator and the creature, and that's a great starting point for viewing all of life. And so our finitude then, and our suffering, draws us into our need in our relationship with others. We become aware of our needs in our finitude, and then we're drawn to God, but also to one another for the help we need because we're limited and finite. Another implication, there's a radical demonstration in the incarnation of Christ of the goodness of human nature, including the physical. It's not just the spiritual that is affirmed in the incarnation, it's the physical. To be incarnated, infleshed, gives a radical affirmation to the flesh. It's God's stamp of approval on the physical realm and a reaffirmation and pronouncement of Genesis 1:31 that declares all the created order very good. And the permanence of Jesus' resurrection, which I don't think most Christians really think about, the permanence of the uniting of divine and human in Christ is vital for us to have an ongoing perception of this. The physical world is not a temporary reality. It's a new heavens and a new earth Christ is going to bring about one day. Another implication, be wary of attempts to escape from our bodies in our worship and our devotional practices. I'm convinced we tend to have an overly spiritualized spirituality, an overly spiritualized view of worship. My students think you can engage in the preaching of the word or worship with a slouched posture that indicates there has nothing to do with the body and the soul. There's this idea that, well, God hears me pray in the shower, He hears me slouching, as if, for instance, as Lewis says, the bodily position has absolutely nothing to do with the posture of our souls, forgetting that whatever the body does affects the soul. And it matters what we do with our bodies because it has a soul effect for good or bad. Sexual immorality has destructive soul implications, and engaging our bodies in worship and spiritual disciplines has profound soul implications for good. And so in our worship practices, in our devotional practices, is there an appreciation for the body where we put words into our prayers even audibly and think about the way we maybe get on our faces or lift our hands or get on our knees? It matters what we do with our bodies, and we tend to dismiss that and have an overly spiritualized spirituality. We need to embrace the physicality of our faith. Also, we need to have a redeemed view of our passions and our sensuality. It's so unfortunate that the word sensual has become just a negative, especially for Christians. Sensual is just sexually provocative. And that's all. But we are sensate creatures. God's made us that way. He's made a world that we perceive with our senses, and we need to redeem this idea of sensuality and appreciate it as Christians. And Christians should be the most sensual people on the planet because we believe God made the world of perception, of sensually perceived things, and gives us this ability to enjoy it and Him. Also, we need to redeem our view of the local church. There is an anti-institutional, and I would say an anti-physical movement about the local church. People love to say, oh, I love God, but I don't like the church. I don't like institutions. The church is a spiritual reality. Emphasizing the universal church as if it doesn't necessarily have to become a physical place. At a physical time that meets in a physical building, people love to say, the church isn't a building. The church isn't a place. Well, I get that. But the church has to be expressed in physical time and space. And so especially among the young, there's this anti-institutional approach to the church, which I think is ascetic. I think it's an anti-physical approach to the church and an over-spiritualization of the Christian life. A couple others. Jesus' pattern we're to follow in life is truly human, in the physical as well as the spiritual. He lived a disciplined life. He memorized Scripture. He meditated on it. He prayed early in the morning with fervency. He was there when the corporate gathering of believers was happening. He wasn't so inward and spontaneous and mystical that there wasn't a very real physical discipline to his spiritual life. We should view our bodies as foundational to our lives as relational beings. Liz has really helped me think about this, that our bodies enable us to be relational the way we are, with God and with other people, and we need to recognize that physical, relational connection. A right relationship with our bodies is one where we experience psychosomatic unity rather than a feeling of alienation from our bodies. We are to embrace our embodied state, our finitude that comes with that. 4 implications for Christian higher ed. Just fodder for discussion in a few minutes. Do we focus our teaching on just the mind or just the spirit at the exclusion of phenomenological experience? Do we subtly denigrate the body in the way we talk about sin, the way we talk about the spiritual life with our students? Do we have a view of pure rationality or a way of understanding the Christian life or the intellectual life as purely rational? Do we seek to reach emotions as well as the minds and physical experiences of our students? How about scholarship and research? Liz, again, pointed me in this direction. This leads us, doesn't it, to collaborative research. We're limited. We're finite. I was talking to a pastor I highly respect a little while ago, and he won't allow himself to listen to or to read anyone else's sermons when he prepares his sermons because he thinks that's somehow cheating. And we had this long discussion about the necessity to learn and grow from others. Think about that. It's just got to be me and Jesus if it's going to be real, if it's going to have integrity, rather than saying it can't be me and Jesus because I have so many limitations in my embodied finite experience. So scholarship and research should and could be collaborative more so than it is. A couple more. Embodiment matters as our roles as advisors and mentors. Do we show our students an example of embodied existence in our lives? Are we willing to talk about being tired or sick or frustrated and our limitations that come up all the time? And do we help them think about that in their own lives? And last, this really has to have implications for us, doesn't it, on the whole idea of distance learning and of the role of technology in learning. I am using PowerPoint less and less because I feel something happen when I flick the lights off and send the attention up here. I watch them become less aware of their embodiment, and I realize this disconnect I start to have with embodied creatures looking at an embodied creature, and it takes on this disembodied feeling. Maybe I'm just perceiving that, but I can't help but think that's what I watch their faces just be less aware of being physically engaged in this whole experience. So distance ed, the role of technology in education, what does it mean for us? Lisa, I know you probably right on along the lines. What does it mean for us to maybe subtly teach our students that listening to a chapel makeup CD is anything the same as gathering with real embodied people, as embodied people in a place where we worship God together? I know we're not saying that, but are we subtly sending messages that listening to this on fast forward as you do 5 other things has anything to do with what happens in that chapel? So we need to be so clear about the way we communicate, even unintentionally along these lines.
Let me pick up on the theme that Eric started talking to us about in terms of what role does the body play in sanctification and redemption. A lot of you had questions about that specific theme when we got some feedback from you last time. As Eric has already kind of mentioned, I think it's really crucial. I think that our bodies play a huge role, not just in the goals of sanctification, that our bodies are also being sanctified, but I think that they are important means for seeking out sanctification. So I really think that there's an integral role for the body in that process. Let me tell you what I think is a story about sanctification. And this is a story about a young woman that I worked with in long-term therapy for a while. And I want to kind of diminish the role of this being about therapy, because the point that I want to make here is that in a dialogue involving paying attention to her body, that there was significant progress, and I think her process of sanctification. And this is something that happens, of course, not only in therapy, but it can happen in good dialogues with friends and pastors, and even our own self-introspection as we become more aware of our bodies. So this is a young woman who was preparing for the ministry and began therapy not because she was experiencing any huge problems in her life, but simply for personal growth, to make herself more effective in her in her ministry, in her preparation for ministry. And fairly quickly in therapy, we started talking about the fact that she had a lot of difficulty in taking herself seriously, her own thoughts, her own emotions, her own perceptions of the world. These are all things that she would second guess. And in fact, it became quite clear that a lot of her behaviors and choices were primarily reactions to the perceived needs and demands of the people around her. One of the areas where we explored this in particular was in her dating relationships. And one of the things that emerged over the period of time that we met, she dated several young men, and there was a pattern that emerged of pushing the boundaries in her physical involvement with them, usually fairly early in the relationship. And one of the things that we both found interesting is that she had kind of a sense of discomfort about this, but she herself, as a committed Christian, expressed surprise that she didn't feel guilty about it unless the man involved felt guilty about it, in which case, she would start feeling guilty about it, which again points to her reliance on other people's reactions even as a source for her own feelings. So we spent time in our meetings together talking more specifically about her experience of physical involvement. And as we talked about it, several sensations came up. So the first of these, very interesting, was a sense of disembodiment. She reported that while she was, making out, she would experience herself as an observer rather than as a participant. And in fact, she had the experience of herself as being kind of up in the corner of the room, watching herself be involved with these men. And what's particularly interesting is that she had no history of sexual abuse or trauma or anything else that might lead to a significant, pathology in that respect. But what was significant is a sense of being very separate from her body's experience, which is kind of this cultural notion that we have talked about. As we talked more about it, there was a second kind of a sensation that was associated with this, and it was a sense of surprise. I can't believe this is happening again. And it was a sense that she was completely unaware of the interpersonal cues between herself and the young men, that this was going to lead to romantic and physical involvement until she was in the middle of it. It would catch her by surprise. She seemed to really just not have access to that interpersonal information that would let her know that this was something that might be coming up. And along with this was a growing realization of how passive she was in those relationships. She not only let the men initiate, but she also didn't sense any kind of empowerment to express her desires or to set limits on the behavior. In fact, on at least one occasion, she was actually really, really angry at the guy because he had just told her that he had no intention of pursuing any kind of long-term relationship with her. But this didn't stop, the physical involvement from happening. So we talked about this for a period of months, and a couple of weeks after our last discussion of the dating issue, she came into session reporting that God was really bringing to her awareness what she called her sins against her own body. Very interesting. And so we processed in the therapy her sense of overwhelming sadness at her failure to listen to her body and consequently to care for it and honor it. And in the following weeks, she did experience a strong sense of resolution around her sexual sins, but at the same time, an experienced sense of conviction regarding her false self, what she articulated as lying to others about who I am by only giving them what they want. That's how she put it in her words. And so it seems that our attention to her body's cues and my encouragement to put into words those bodily experiences that she was barely aware of had opened the doors to a lot more attentiveness to other aspects of her embodiment. And so she was much more aware of external cues in the environment, the perceptual information that her body was giving her. She was more aware of the interpersonal cues in her relationships with others without feeling kind of this automatic need to respond to them. So there was kind of more of a sense of being in control of that as she was aware of it. And she was definitely more attentive to her own experiences, including her emotions, and more committed to using them in relating genuinely to others. And so in summary, as she experienced more of this sense of oneness with the body that Eric has mentioned, this allowed her to relate to others in healthier, more genuine ways. And so I point you back to what we talked about earlier, that if the functions of the body are about showing people who God is, primarily through the relational functions of the body, that paying attention to the body's cues, to the body's information, to the emotional information from the body is something that as she progressed in that area, she was able to fulfill the functions of the body better. And I think this is something that is true of all of us, and should really be a significant part of our sanctification experience. Eric mentioned the role of the spiritual disciplines, and really I think that this is an important place where our sanctification and our body meet, because of course the spiritual disciplines are things that are done with the body. They're primarily bodily experiences, and I think that this does help us to align the purposes of the body with what God wants for them. Unfortunately, even the spiritual disciplines can be done in very unhelpful ways. And so I think that our tendency, at least my tendency in the little exposure that was given to spiritual disciplines in my upbringing, when they were brought up, it was primarily in kind of this modernist form of embodiment, where the purpose of fasting, for example, was to kind of cut yourself off even more from the body. Learn how to ignore it. Learn how to ignore the physical cues that your body was giving you. Learn to dominate it, right? Instead of a sense of really experiencing very intensely your embodiment. You know, when your stomach is rumbling and it's reminding you of your need for God, that's a very different thing than using the spiritual disciplines to cut ourselves off from the body. And so we need to be aware that even when we are doing the spiritual disciplines, that we can do them in very unhelpful ways instead of using them for the goals of connecting us more with our body. So the spiritual disciplines allow us as whole embodied people to experience more fully God's indwelling presence, His glory, and His temple. It allows us to cooperate with the Holy Spirit, bearing the fruit of His presence with our bodies. So what would a spirituality that takes seriously our embodiment look like in practice? In the first place, I think that it means that we need to take really seriously our emotions, not to suppress them, not to diminish their role in our lives, but to help us figure out what's going on in our souls. I'm not suggesting here that emotions are an infallible guide to action. That really is kind of a contemporary notion that a lot of our students have. It's part of our culture that, you know, you just have to figure out what it is you really feel or really want and then act on it. That's not what I'm suggesting, because our body is fallen, our emotions are fallen, as is every other part of us. But having said that, our emotions can give us extremely useful information for what's going on inside of us, and extremely useful information about what's going on in our interpersonal relationships. They're critical diagnostic indicators. So an embodied spirituality takes seriously the emotions. An embodied spirituality also takes relationships seriously. If we think of our bodies as being things that we are that allow us to connect with others, then they're really crucial in nurturing our spirituality. And so being a part of community is really essential, and this is really reaffirming what Eric said in terms of involvement in the church. It's no coincidence that the body is used as a metaphor for the community of believers. And so I think that even when we think about spiritual disciplines, we need to think not only of the private ones, things like fasting and solitude and prayer, but also the public disciplines. The experience of worshiping together in chapel, the experience of reciting together as a body the Lord's Prayer, partaking of the Lord's Supper in community. These are all disciplines that help to bind us to others more fully, and should be things that we take very seriously in terms of our spiritual formation. One discipline that I rarely hear mentioned is the discipline of meeting together regularly. We are enjoined not to forsake meeting with other believers. And sometimes that really is a discipline, right? In our busy lives, when we could use that extra, few hours on Sunday mornings or Saturday nights. And meeting with others is eminently embodied. We sit in hard pews, we hear our neighbors singing off key, we hear the baby in the next pew crying, and this is all part of our life as believers. And so this is something that I think that we should practice with as much diligence as we do with the more private spiritual disciplines. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. I have a friend who's a pastor at a church that takes church discipline very seriously, and I asked him, about how many discipline situations do you have a year? He said about 8 or 10. And I said, 8 or 10 discipline? He said, what are they mostly for? And he said, most of them are discipline for non-attendance. Because members of the church commit to attending regularly, and they're taking that so seriously and not dismissing it as this sort of optional thing. that you can get disciplined by your church for not regularly attending. And I don't think it's in some draconian, overly legalistic way. They just want to send a clear message of exactly what you're saying. This is something we're created for and can't grow without. And so, especially because you commit to it as a member of the church, they feel completely free to discipline members for non-attendance.
Eric, we have 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
Should we talk a little bit about body self-care or move on to questions? What do you think?
It's up to you.
Okay, well, let me talk briefly about
bullet or two.
self-appearance issues. You know, one of the areas that several people had questions about are issues of modesty and those types of issues. And as I mentioned, particularly last time we met, we live in an era where self-enhancement of our bodies, we have limitless possibilities for that, from things ranging from the fairly trivial, like whitening our teeth, coloring our hair, to very invasive procedures that are quite drastic in terms of their effects on our bodies. And so how do we go about navigating whether we should engage in these or not? And these might not strike you as ethical issues, but I think in light of what we've been talking about, they actually are. And so one of the things that I think we need to struggle with as we engage in these self-care issues is whether they are consistent with the goal of our bodies, what our bodies are for. So what might this look like? One way in which this might turn out to be a conflict is that sometimes cumulatively our efforts at self-enhancement take up a great amount of our resources, our time, our money, our efforts. I know of people who can't walk outside the door until they spent 2 or 3 hours, putting themselves together. And so when the goals of self-enhancement, of presenting ourselves in a certain way, actually get in the way of our being with people and showing them who God is, that's clearly an area where our self-enhancement processes are working against the goals of the body. Sometimes self-enhancement directly works against the created functions of the body. And so one thing that's becoming increasingly common in our culture is breast surgery, which is happening at increasingly younger ages all of the time. And one of the things that the research shows about this is that breast surgery makes it 3 times more likely that a woman trying to breastfeed will have an inadequate milk supply. And so if you think about this as the important relational connection with her child that occurs during breastfeeding, then clearly this is a self-enhancement procedure that goes against the created designs of the body. Another one has to do with the use of Botox. So you probably know what Botox is. You inject it, around the eyes. It takes the wrinkles away, but it's actually a toxin. You inject it, and what it does is it paralyzes the muscles. And so there's a psychologist and researcher by the name of Stephen Porges from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he has done some really amazing research about how the nonverbal responsiveness of our upper face serves an incredibly important function in helping us to connect meaningfully to others. And he says that particularly the muscles in this area of the face help us both in the expression of emotional communication to others, but also being able to read other people's social cues. When these muscles are paralyzed, literally it becomes more difficult for us to identify the verbal tone of other people's communications to us. It tends to fade into the background. Amazing what paralyzing a few muscles will do. And so this is clearly a case where the self-enhancement processes work directly against our ability to connect emotionally with other people. I think that taking the goal of the body in mind also is really helpful in terms of modesty issues. I spoke last time of self-objectification, of how women and increasingly men have internalized the objectification of our culture that says that our bodies are primarily for the sexual consumption of others. And I really think that a lot of times the immodesty that we see on campus is simply young women in unthinking ways expressing the self-objectification that has already occurred in terms of their lives. And so I think we can have really important roles as mentors and teachers in helping them think about the purposes of their body and whether it really does help other people to see God and God's presence and power in their bodies when they're distracted by cleavage and other body parts. And so I think that thinking carefully about the purposes of the body can be very helpful to us in thinking through some of these self-care and appearance issues.
Theologians have talked about being made in the image of God and the way we see that it manifested. It's almost always been a very disembodied conception. It's rational capability, it's spiritual ability, which are all manifestations, but very seldom do you find theologians saying, one of the ways we're manifesting the image of God is in our embodied state, that our physical bodies, not to say God is by nature physical, we're not Mormon, but we do act like God with our bodies. We do talk and hear and see and act as embodied creatures. And in that sense, that's a great description of us. We are instruments of God, made in His image to reflect His glory in this world, and we do that as embodied creatures. Instruments is a great word, or even weapons to do His warfare. That's good. Last table talk, Liz turned to the faculty, all of you, and said, if I asked you to think about your body, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And I wish you could have seen your faces. Across the room, there was this overwhelming, oy vey. Some people even went like this, or there was this and chuckling, where do I begin? And there was no sense of, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. It was overwhelming. The leaders of our students have a, where do I begin? And so I think first we need to think about what we're communicating to our students and the way we talk about our embodiment and embodiment in general, because we set the tone. I think we need to take responsibility for negativity along these lines in the way we moan and groan. Now we're fallen and there's something to moan and groan about, but we need to make sure we distinguish between fallenness and finitude. And one's intended, one's a tragic result of the fall, which will be taken care of, but will stay finite. I don't know what you want to add to June's great question.
The focus on appearance is so pervasive that it makes sense that they would feel that way. What concerns me is that sometimes what I see in Christian circles is just kind of a baptizing of the concern with appearances. And so we don't direct people to the marvelous functions of the body. Instead, we say, but you are beautiful, dear.
Yeah.
You know? God sees you as beautiful. I see you as beautiful. Well, no. How about just not focusing on the pure appearance of something? I think that we do young people a service when we continue to focus on that and simply just kind of try to expand our definitions of what beauty looks like. I think that it needs to be on, marvelously made for certain functions, for certain purposes. Look at what your body can do. Look how amazing the body is.
And even as leaders, we can get sucked into that. I don't know how many students you've worked with eating disorders, but people tend to say, but you look great. You're so thin already. As if you've accomplished what you need to. And going there is exactly what you're saying. Continuing down that road that they're already going down that they shouldn't be going down in the first place. So we need to think seriously about how we set the agenda. Yeah, I don't know if you have ever seen the film that's the life of William Carey. But there's this scene I will never forget in that film, and it's based on a true experience he had. Through the whole beginning of the half of the film, I'm thinking, oh man's got some goofy hair working, and he had this sort of funny-looking hair. And God kept humbling William Carey and breaking him, and finally his print shop burns down, and he's saying, what is going on? And he's sitting there wrestling with God, and he comes to an awareness of his pride, even in the midst of this kind of missionary work. And he, in the midst of this humbling, he reaches up, and you don't know it when you're watching the movie, but he's got a wig on. And he whips it off, and he's bald, and he throws the wig in this gesture of, I'm done with this. I'm done with this superficial William Carey exaltation, and I'm really going to live for God now. And it's this physical gesture of his baldness that's just amazing. And you're shocked because you don't know it until this scene in the movie. And he does, and to me, I've thought of that scene so many times when I'm tempted to get caught up on superficial nonsense that in God's economy doesn't matter at all. Thanks for that, Rafe. That's so helpful. And the one I notice most is apologizing for crying. And usually when a student does that, or someone I'm talking to does that, they're crying for really good reasons. And my wife is so emotionally in tune and intelligent emotionally that she really tends to cry at all the right times. And she actually starting to get indignant when people aren't crying when they should be. Yet what do we say immediately? I'm sorry, I'm crying. And I'm revealing such frailty right now. I know it must be making you uncomfortable. And I've started to say that. And I say, if you weren't crying right now in light of talking about these hard things, you should apologize because there's something dead in your heart if you're not. So exactly what you're saying, we tend to be very apologetic for being human.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.